Hey, Lizette, great to have you in this class. I know you're like super busy getting ready for next week, Kids Week, I think you called it in your intro video at your church. And I can only imagine you're probably completely swamped. But I want to send you a reply video here in week one and tell you I think the work you've done in both of these forums is great. Appreciate you engaging the various sources carefully. Um, you got to the context of Habakkuk at the end of the first response forum, and I think that you pointed to something important in that the prophet is pleading with God, complaining to God, and faith somehow means the trust that God will make things right. And as you say, it's not an appeal to certain rules that God will enforce necessarily. It is simply a reliance on God to be merciful but true to God's promises. And in that sense, the faith of the prophet, the faith of the just one, depends on the faith of God, the trustworthiness of God. And that's where I think the faith of God or the faithfulness of God and the faith of the human go closely together and are embodied in one person, in Jesus, um, the sort of embodiment of divine and human faith in one person. Um, I like what you're talking about with some of the different conflicts that seem to be evident in Paul's letter to the Romans. There's a lot of different ways we might analyze what sort of social divisions Paul seems to be addressing. You've named several possibilities. I think, for my part, that um, many of the commentators do not pay enough attention to the way Paul addresses his audience as of Gentile background. He says that in chapter 1 as part of the sort of Thanksgiving introduction of the letter. He's going to make it explicit again in chapter 11. And because of that, I think that there's no place in the letter where we should be reading Paul to correct something going on with Jews or characteristic of Jews, because he's always addressing the letter to people of Gentile background, even when that has to do with how they're using the law of Moses or how they're relating to the God of Israel. These are people of Gentile background that have been welcomed into the promised family of Abraham. And Paul is addressing some of the tensions that they are dealing with, some of which do include hostilities between them and some of Paul's Jewish relatives, probably in Rome. So, anyway, that's a way of characterizing the audience that I think gets underplayed by some of the secondary writers that we're following. So keep thinking about that. What you've got here from Eliot in the second forum is great. I think the sort of political, imperial context of Romans has been also underestimated a lot in the kind of history of the Christian reception of the letter. And so I want to try to recover what I take to be its anti-imperial edge. And yet, I hasten to add that where this plays out, this gospel about Jesus as the Messiah, as the Lord, um, against Roman rule, is not primarily in the halls of Roman power that we might think of. It's not in a very sort of out in your face kind of political movement. Not that that's a bad thing, but that's just not quite what we find in Romans, where it plays out this anti imperial edge is in the way that the community in Rome relate to one another, the way they treat each other, the way that they negotiate their difficulties, the way that they learn to avoid judging one another or ruling over one another, and instead to treat one another with the same grace that has been shown them by God. And that to me is the primary theater of the power of the gospel in Romans. So, um, not that it's wrong, to be anti imperial in a more kind of uh, immediately out on the street kind of way, you might say. But I just think it's significant that Romans features an anti imperial community whose power is about how they treat one another, how they gather with each other, especially the way that they share their lives and their goods with each other. So we'll be talking about it more, but good work in week one and great to have you in the class. Welcome.